Good morning, guys. It is a rainy day here. Boy, our weather changed, didn't it? So, in the news right now, a lot of things that we're talking about our upcoming election. We've got an election coming up in November, and we've been campaigning for it and choosing candidates and having primaries. And one of the big concerns, because we're going through our COVID crisis, is that how are people going to vote? Because typically our polling places, the elections, are held in community centers where you go to your local school or your local church or a library or something like that. It's a community gathering. People get together, they cast their ballots in private voting booths, and they're collected and counted and sent off. But those places are closed now. We're all staying at home. So are we going to open them back up and risk infection, or are we going to keep them closed and then limit the amount of voting that people can actually do? A couple of proposals are expanding the vote by mail ballot, which some people already do, but if you haven't already signed up for that, can you sign up for it now? Is it too late? That's one of those things that they're trying to expand to make sure everybody can vote. Online voting is another thing. Both of those have their concerns. But what we want, our ultimate goal with this, is to have as many people vote as possible. One of the reasons we want as many people to vote as possible is to know the will of the people. So as we gather votes, we know a little bit about each region, each community, each county, each state, and as the nation as a whole, we know what the needs are of those areas, we know what they want, and a little bit about how they want their problem solved, what concerns they have, and what approaches to those solutions best appeal to them. So I'm hoping that we figure out something where the most people possible can vote so that we can have an election that really does represent the will of the people. Because election concerns are significant. They determine the results that will happen to our country for not just years, but sometimes for generations. That takes us into today's lesson as we talk about the impact of something on generations. We're talking about civil rights. We're talking about the southern states after the Civil War. We talked about sharecropping before. I'm going to go into a little bit more of sharecropping. Sharecropping, we talked about it as economic slavery. You've got the landowner who is sharing his land with his maybe his former slaves or some other people that were freedmen that were former slaves. Sometimes it was poor white people also, but for the most part these were African Americans that had no resources, so sharecropping was a good avenue for getting employment, being able to pay for things. But I was reading last night about one of the laws in Alabama at the time was that, okay, so if you were growing cotton, you were not allowed to transport or sell cotton between the hours of sundown to sunup. That meant that as soon as the sun went down, you cannot travel with cotton, you cannot sell it, you cannot do anything with it until sunup the next day. Now the problem with that, it sounds pretty simple, it seems a little bit ridiculous, like why would you care if anybody was traveling with it, but the problem with that is that if you were a sharecropper, you were making such a thin margin of profit on your land that you needed to have all of those daylight hours to be working. In fact, your landowner probably wanted you working, and if you weren't working on the crops, you probably had to do something else for him. So you were obligated to work for your landowner from sunup to sundown. So you were already obligated for those times. And then if after those hours were over, you didn't have the liberty to go out and try and sell the crop that you had raised, well, the problem is that you would have to sell to only one person. You were only limited to selling to your landowner, and he could pay you any price he wanted. So effectively that meant that all of the crop that you raised, whether it was something that you were sharing with him or you were raising it for your own profit, all of it belonged to the landowner. Economic slavery, right there. All right, moving on. The Supreme Court, one of our divisions of government, the judicial system, very, very important in deciding the cases of law as they go through the court system, whether or not they meet with the requirements of the Constitution or if they violate the Constitution. It's one of our ways of enforcing constitutional amendments, enforcing laws that are supposed to apply to the entire nation and not just to the individual states or counties or cities. This is a Supreme Court case that's not in your book, but I want to tell you a little bit about it because it sets the groundwork for some of the backpedaling, the losses that we had after Reconstruction. The Crookshanks case in 1875. So, even without laws limiting blacks, there were other methods. There were methods of terror. So we had the Ku Klux Klan that was going around, private citizens terrorizing, scaring people, burning down houses, burning down churches, murder, assault, all kinds of things, intended to scare blacks from being part of the political process, being part of regular society, being anything equal to whites in their daily lives. Where that comes most into play, we're going to come back to voting. There were a couple of blacks, 2 black men, that were trying to exercise their constitutional right to vote. They were trying to vote in Louisiana in 1875. They were lynched. They were strung up and hung by a group of about 100 white people just for trying to vote. And it wasn't just that 2 black men were lynched. The reason that these lynchings happened, and these lynchings happened frequently throughout the South, the reason these lynchings happened was that it was something to scare other black people that don't try to vote. This is what will happen to you. They wanted to make sure that everybody knew about this type of terror. So this was a lynching. Today we would call it a hate crime, but we didn't have hate crimes back then. This would be a lynching. It would be a murder. Now, murder is not a federal crime. It is a state crime. It's a crime that would be prosecuted by a state government. So it was actually on the state of Louisiana to prosecute the people who were responsible for this murder. And they chose not to. And I couldn't find a reason why they said that they chose not to, but they chose not to. So a federal jury, or a federal attorney, charged them with preventing peaceful assembly, which was something that is protected by the Constitution. So if they're preventing the peaceful assembly of 2 people that are trying to vote, peaceful assembly, okay, we can use that as trying a federal case. So they tried the people for preventing peaceful assembly, and they were found guilty. And then it was appealed and it was sent up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked at it and said, they always weigh whether or not this violates a constitutional principle, but often one of the first questions they ask is this even something that the Supreme Court, the federal government, is in control of? They decided that the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, limits any government infringing on the rights of a person, access to life, liberty, and property, but this wasn't the government doing it. It was private citizens, so you're out of luck. Meaning that the only way that the Supreme Court would intervene is if the government of Louisiana enacted a law that limited these people from voting. But as long as it was private citizens, it's up to the state to prosecute them. And because the state didn't want to prosecute them, then nothing would happen. Nothing would happen. People could continue to be assaulted and murdered, and nothing would happen. Nothing would protect them for this right of being able to vote, because it apparently was just private citizens doing it and not a government doing it. Really disappointing, and it really set the tone that the South was going to be able to reenact a lot of these limitations to blacks in one way or another. Okay, a couple of examples we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the poll tax, the literacy clause, and the grandfather clause. All right, poll taxes. Poll taxes are an old thing, but it's one of those things that can limit you if you did not, like traditionally, historically, going way back, if you were a landowner, that was one of the first requirements for being able to vote. We eventually got rid of that, but now some of the states in the South were instituting a poll tax. You had to pay a small fee in order to vote. If you were poor, and most blacks in the South were poor, then that limited you. You wouldn't be able to vote. It might limit some white people too, though, so we'll have to work on that. Literacy tests. Literacy tests. Okay, remember, slaves, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read or write. So a literacy test was actually going to be something that, unless they really quickly learned how to read and write, that might be a problem and limit them from voting. But there was more to it. The literacy test that you were given, say you go to the polling place and you're like, I'm ready to cast my vote, I'm a citizen and I'd like to vote for who I think should lead our country. Great. I just need you to read this document and then explain it to me. So it might be an easy document, might be a difficult document, might be an excerpt from the Constitution and you'd have to explain all the ramifications of it. That might be kind of difficult. And then the person who's the tester gets to evaluate and say, yeah, you kind of told me what it was about, but I don't really think that you understood it. You didn't explain it really, really well. I'm not going to let you vote. Sometimes it was a test. It was a list of questions that presumably you would know the answers to because you had been reading and you knew how to read and you'd been exercising your right to read to study the U.S. government. In the links, I'm going to give you a link to an example of a literacy test and see how well you do with some of those questions. There's like 68 questions in there. Now, if you went in there, you might be expected to answer all of the questions and answer all of them 100% right. If you were a black person and you answered all of them right, the tester might say, yeah, but I think you guessed on this one, and this one I think you guessed on, so I'm not going to let you vote. If you were a white person and you went in there, they might ask you, oh, just answer number 4. Yeah, that sounds close enough. That's close enough. You had the right idea. It was still limited to the person who was giving the test to decide whether or not you had the privilege of voting. So that's the literacy tests. Limit to access to voting. All right, next one, grandfather clauses. Now we use this term today. So whenever we talk about there's a grandfather clause, talk about my house, whatever codes it has that doesn't necessarily meet the way it was built now, doesn't necessarily meet the way that it should be built if it was built 200 years ago. Maybe there's some different restrictions in place, and definitely we have new earthquake standards that we didn't have 100 years ago. But a grandfather clause starts out with this. If your grandfather was able to vote and voted, and we have a record of him voting, then you get to vote. Okay, it's kind of weird, but I suppose it works, meaning that voting citizens are identified by the fact that their family has always been voting. Except the 15th Amendment that allowed African Americans the right to vote, that gave them that right, that enforced that right, it wasn't enacted until 1870. And up till that point, blacks in the South and even some northern states were not allowed to vote. So let's just say that your voting rights for your family started in 1870. And to vote back then, you had to be 21. It wasn't vote at 18, it was vote at 21. You had to be 21 years old in order to vote. So if you were 21, if your grandfather was 21 in 1870, had voted at the first chance he got, and he had a child at the age of 16, and that child, your father, had a child at the age of 16, and that brings you to you, by the time you were 21 and able to vote, would be 1902, at the earliest. That meant that effectively people who were African Americans would not be able to vote, not be allowed to vote, at least for a few generations of years. Actually, it would go even further than that, because if your father was barred from voting because it wasn't his grandfather that was able to vote, and you were barred from voting because your father couldn't vote and your grandfather couldn't vote, this could go on for generations. See, you have to have one grandfather be able to vote for the next person to vote, for the next person to vote. This is the grandfather clause, and the court, or the states that put this into place in the South, knew it was unconstitutional, and they knew that it was only a matter of time before it would be challenged and it would be knocked down, but it would give them some time at least to remove African Americans from the voting process. And the Democratic government that were coming back into power and undoing a lot of those changes that Reconstruction was putting into place. Check out the rise and fall of Jim Crow. It's a link that I'm putting into the transcript, and I'll put a link on our Google Classroom. It takes you on an interactive journey of someone trying to vote in the South and the obstacles that they would face, and they are significant. They're like sharecropping. They don't even get close to approaching your goal. You want to vote, you go out there, and in most cases you get shut down right away, but if you're really lucky, you've got the grandfather laws locked in, you've got the poll tax locked in, you've got the literacy test locked in. If you get all of that, you still might be intimidated by someone who wants to kill you for trying to vote. Your goals today: log into Schoology and Google Classroom, get your attendance taken, check out your assignments. You're supposed to do the practice to complete heading assignment. Make sure you turn that in. A lot of you guys are on the right track with that. Some of you have some questions about it. Post a question for me. I'm replying back to you guys, letting you know, okay, that looks good, except you need this extra line here. I want you guys to make sure that you get this skill underway before you get into high school. And then I'm giving you another assignment, a new assignment today. I need you to write a paragraph, a nice solid 6-sentence paragraph explaining the challenges to voting. Okay, we'll talk more tomorrow, more Supreme Court cases, and hope you guys have a nice, beautiful, rainy day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.